It's a balmy 87 degrees as the sun sinks below the scrubby vegetation of the Texas Hill Country. You're standing at the edge of the largest colony of mammals in the world, Bracken Bat Cave. Underground, beyond the mouth of the cave, are 20 million bats sitting in darkness. And just like you, they've been waiting for nightfall. Silhouetted against the last remnants of a burnt orange sunset, the emergence begins as a trickle. What looks like a thin finger of smoke that rises into the sky and dissipates. Over the next few minutes, the flow of bats exiting the cave grows and grows, becoming a flood that bursts forth in organized chaos. Hundreds of thousands of bats flapping away into the night. With your eyes closed, you hear the beating of countless wings, a sound few people get to experience. These bats are heading off to hunt the flying insects that make up their diet, but each night brings them face to face with danger. Plenty of animals consider bats a tasty treat, but increasingly they're having to navigate human-made threats as well. Wind turbines are an incredible option for capturing renewable, carbon-neutral energy, but their high-speed blades present a deadly obstacle for bats and other flying wildlife. This week, we interviewed a scientist who's working to solve that exact problem, Dr. Sarah Fritts at Texas State University. Her work is breaking new ground, finding ways for bats and wind farms to coexist in a world that's leaving fossil fuels in the dust.
Welcome to Conservation Connection, the show where we do just that, connect you to the people that are working in the field of conservation. My name's Chance.
And I'm Sarah Catherine.
And this week, we are so excited to be talking about bats.
So excited. We love a good story time at the top of the show now. And I guess you guys must like it too, because last week's episode performed so well. We are so thrilled and just amazed by the numbers we're seeing. So thank you so much for listening and telling your friends. The response has been so amazing.
If you're a new listener here, we really appreciate you showing up. I hope you stick around, enjoy the stories that we're telling. Really, what I want you to do is learn how to love our planet by listening to the people who are doing that every day. It was incredible to open up my phone this week and see a notification that we hit the number 9 slot for nature podcasts in the United States. That is 100% thanks to you guys listening and sharing the show. We are so appreciative of your support.
Yeah, absolutely. And that fluctuates often, but for now we're holding on to that number 9 spot, and we're so proud of the show and just want to thank you all so much for listening and all of your support.
So what are we talking about this week, Sarah Catherine?
This week, we are talking about bats, and more specifically, we're talking about how bats interact with their environment, and even more specifically, we're talking about how they interact with wind turbines.
It's a really fun conversation because we're constantly looking for carbon neutral sources of energy, right? Ways where we're not having to burn fuel pulled out of the ground and sending more carbon into the atmosphere. And a lot of people talk about wind energy as this sort of solve all solution. And it is an excellent solution. It provides really good, clean energy. But one of the things that people don't talk about is that wind turbines can cause big problems for flying wildlife like birds and bats.
But there's definitely hope, and people are working to see how we can fix those problems. So that's what this story is basically about. I was really excited to get to tell this story because I think a lot of people can think of bats as in that spectrum of creepy crawlies, honestly. But I remember growing up and sitting on the patio outside with my family when I was young and just watching bats fly overhead, catching all the mosquitoes and small bugs and just being enthralled with them. Honestly, wherever you live, you could probably walk outside when it's a buggy night and see some bats around.
Yeah, they're a really cool piece of our ecosystem that gets a bad rap, but they do so much good. I mean, if you listen through the episode, you're going to learn exactly how many pounds of bugs bats eat each night and how that relates to the number of Ford F-150s, which is a very American way of measuring it, but it is a good way to put it into terms that people understand. Bats are very, very important parts of our ecosystem, and so it's important that we find ways for them to coexist with this new renewable energy infrastructure that we're trying to build.
one of my largest and most memorable experiences that I've had with bats was when you and I went to visit Bamberger Ranch, a ranch you worked on for a very long time, and we got to see the bat emergence one morning. And it's really just kind of life-changing, honestly. It's just insane.
Yeah, it's this natural phenomenon that you wouldn't ever expect, especially with these large cave roosting groups that can be in such high densities. And so when they come in and out of the cave, which they do as a group, it's just it's shocking to see what is effectively a mouse with wings zipping around, and there's thousands of them. And one of the really cool things about the cave at the Bamberger Ranch is that it's man-made. And not only is it man-made, but it was built in a way so that scientists could get in there and observe the bats without changing their behavior, which is why they called it the chiroptorium, like an auditorium. As we talk about in the episode, Chiroptera is the scientific name for bats as a group. So it was like an auditorium for watching bats. And it's just a magical experience to be standing there amidst this cloud. And you're like, surely one of them is going to hit me because there are so many of them, but they don't. They're so good at navigating in that big crowded space that there's not a problem at all.
Yeah, I will say though, I'm pretty sure I felt a couple drops of bat pee on me while we were standing there.
Hey, that's all part of the experience. You got to take the good with the bat pee.
Yes, definitely. And I have a few pictures from that experience. So I will be posting that on Instagram. So if you're on Instagram and you follow us, go check that out. It'll be later this week.
A couple other fun things to note. One, this interview was recorded at EarthX in Dallas, Texas this April. EarthX is a really cool forum where people from all sides of the aisle get together and talk about ways to solve the environment's biggest problems. If you are in Dallas around Earth Day, 1,000% you guys should go check it out because it is an incredible place to catch some really cool conversations about how we're protecting the planet.
Yes, it definitely is. And like Chance said, it's the week of Earth Day. They already have dates and early bird tickets out for next year, which is crazy because I feel like it just happened. But anyway, if you're interested, check them out. Hopefully we'll be there again next year.
The other fun thing is that we are traveling next week to Sun Valley, Idaho. Again, if you're a longtime listener, you've probably heard several episodes come out of the Sun Valley Forum.
This will be our third year there.
And we are really excited to be going back there. Again, another really cool conference where there's incredible conversations about how we can protect our environment.
We love people who love the environment. It's really fun to be around those people. So again, on Instagram, you can look out for some of our live stories that we'll be posting and updating while we're in Sun Valley.
Also, we got an amazing review this past week. Like I said before, it's the highlight of my week to get feedback from you guys. So I just want to give a shout out to Henrik Shamala, who left us a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts. It really matters when people leave reviews and rate us because it helps other conservation-minded people find the show. So thank you so much, Henrik, for leaving us such a glowing review.
If you want to know a little about what that glowing review says, in case you don't have Apple Podcasts and can't look at it, it says, "I work in the conservation field, and lots of the time things look very bleak. The people, animals, and solutions that you discuss in the show give me hope and inspire me to keep pushing." So thank you again. You're wonderful. We love you all.
If you want to hear us shout out your name, give us a review. We love to do it. You love to listen. Let's be friends.
So for now, we hope you enjoyed the show.
We are so excited today to be sitting down with Dr. Sarah Fritts. She's an associate professor of wildlife ecology at Texas State University in San Marcos. She does some really cool studies looking at how wildlife uses an area and how that can change. And I'm very, very excited for this conversation. Thank you so much for being on the show with us today.
Hey, thanks for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Yeah, absolutely. So funny story. We actually got to meet last night at one of the after parties, and we, grew up in the same kind of smallish town, random place. So it's just a funny little connection, and that we even bumped into each other at the party, and you were like, "Oh wait, am I going to be on your podcast tomorrow?"
And you're both named Sarah.
Yes.
Yeah, right.
It was so random, and it's literally 2 miles away from where my grandmother has lived her entire life.
Yeah,
so.
Absolutely crazy. So it just means that you were meant to be on the show with us today.
I agree.
So
And we're so glad to have you here.
Thanks.
Yeah, and I'm really excited because one of the things that you study specifically is bats, and I don't think we've ever done an episode on bats on the podcast.
And as we were doing some research for this episode, I realized I don't know the name for a bat scientist, but I'm going to take a stab at it.
Okay.
Is it a chiroptologist?
That would work pretty well. I mean, I don't consider myself a chiroptologist, but yeah, I could see that.
Right? Because they're Chiroptera is the order that covers bats, which if you break down the Latin of that, that's chiro, and then ptera, P-T-E-R-A, like pterodactyl, and it means hand wing.
It does.
Because people don't realize that their wings are supported by finger bones. If you look at it from a comparative anatomy standpoint, they're basically standing there with their hands at their shoulders and spread super wide, and they've got pelagium. Is that the membrane that stretches between that makes
Patagium.
The wing? Patagium. They basically have webbed fingers, and they use that to fly. The world's only flying mammals.
Yep, that's true. And their fingers are just really elongated.
Yeah. Yeah. If you ever see an x-ray of a bat, it's so cool to look at their bone structure because you're like, oh yeah, I totally see how they're a mammal.
Yeah, they look like little mice too, a little bit. Although they're not very closely related to mice at all, but they kind of look like little mice.
Small and fluffy.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And especially here in Texas, we've got the Mexican free-tail bat, which has the little mouse tail that extends out, which is an uncommon feature in bats. So it's totally understand why people call them flying mice.
Yeah. In German, it's Fledermaus.
Really?
Yeah.
Interesting.
German has the best name for animals. One of the other podcasts we did was with somebody from Turtle Island, and she was saying that in German, a turtle is a shield toad.
Oh, wow.
Right? A toad that has a shield on its back.
They're very literal.
They really got it right. They're like, what does this look like? All right, cool. So anyway, you don't just study bats. Bats isn't just like your main focus. So I would love for you to tell us a little bit more about what you do and what your main focus is.
Sure. Well, yes, I do study a variety of different wildlife taxa and species. Since moving to Texas, it's been concentrated on bats, but it's really the bigger question that drew me to bats, which is wind energy. And bigger than that, just renewable energy. So I did my PhD 10 years ago, finished at North Carolina State University, and that focused on renewable energy as well. But that was woody biomass. And that's because in 2010, the European Union increased their renewable portfolio standards, requiring more renewables being used there. And unexpectedly, a lot of that renewable source came from southeastern forests. So it was wood that was cut down, leftover residual woody debris, and it was being chipped and shipped to Europe to satisfy their renewable portfolio standards. So conservationists started thinking, well, how is this going to affect our ground-dwelling wildlife? So there I studied, reptiles, amphibians, and small mammal response to harvesting different amounts of wood. Fast forward to Texas. Here, the big thing is wind energy. We're the biggest producer of wind of any state. Over 3 times the wind is produced in Texas as any other state. And if Texas were its own country, it'd be the 5th largest wind producer in the world.
Wow.
Yeah. So unfortunately, an unintended consequence of wind energy is bat fatalities. So that's really what drew me to bats. Although I've studied bats on and off for many years before that as well.
So when you say that we have bat fatalities as a consequence of wind energy, as somebody who has not studied this and does not have a PhD in sort of this wildlife renewable energy relations, I'm imagining that you have these massive wind turbines that are, swishing through the air very quickly, creating electricity and acting as giant fan blades that are physically hitting bats in flight, or the massive pressure waves that are created are really disruptive to what we just described as literally a mouse that has very delicate bone structure. Does that kind of sum up the issue of like this conflict between bats and wind turbines?
It does. And it is a conflict. It's more of a green dilemma. I think most people, we know we need renewable energy, right? And it's expanding very rapidly. It's just an unintended consequence. But you are correct. I think a lot of people look at wind turbines from far away and don't realize how fast the tips can actually spin. They can spin at about a quarter of the speed of sound.
Oh my gosh.
Yes. Over 100 miles per hour. Are they spinning that fast all the time? No, not necessarily, but they often are. And unfortunately, it seems that bats might be attracted to wind turbines. So it's a little different than birds, which more opportunistically get hit. So they're flying through an area and they just get hit. Whereas bats, it seems that certain species actually go towards the wind turbines.
And I know that bats have a really interesting set of detection senses, right? Using sound and echolocation, et cetera. So what is it about wind turbines that seem to be so attractive to bats? Do we know?
We have no idea. So there's been a lot of research over the past, decade and a half to try to figure that out. Well, I say a lot. In my world, it kind of seems like a lot, but we need way more research is what we need.
Right.
But people have looked at the sound and light patterns and other things, but we have not figured out exactly why some bats seem to be attracted. The reason we think that is about 3/4 of the bat fatalities are actually only 3 species. So other bats are being hit, but it's our tree-dwelling migratory bats that are being hit more commonly. Whereas birds, a lot of different species are hit. Again, it's just more opportunistic, but it doesn't seem to be causing population-level concerns for birds as it is for some of our bat species.
So your research is kind of obviously studying this and looking at this, and I'm assuming finding solutions of, okay, how do we mitigate this? How do we make it so we can have renewable energy, so we can have these wind turbines, but so they're not killing these bats?
Correct. Most of the research that I've always been interested in are more applied, applicable to guiding future mitigation measures of some sort or habitat plans or something like that. When it comes to bats and wind, one, we are trying to figure out why they're attracted, because if we could figure that out, maybe we could do something about it. But two, how to keep bats from being killed. Right now, the main ways to do that is curtailment. So basically shutting down the wind turbines at certain wind speeds or other active periods for bats. But also deterrence. So some companies are manufacturing deterrents, and deterrents could be a wide range of things. The most common are acoustic deterrents. So they emit high frequency noises as well that are similar to the bat echolocation calls. And it's thought to basically just make it an unattractive airspace in the dangerous area of the wind turbine, the rotor swept area.
That reminds me a little bit of like you hear stores that play like high-pitched noises because they don't want the lousy youths hanging around and only the teenagers can hear them. Have you heard about that?
No.
Yeah, so like shopping malls or whatever, outdoor spaces that feel like there's teenagers hanging around too much or playing like that high-pitched noise that you lose the ability to hear as you get out of those teenage years in an effort to make it an unattractive airspace like you're talking about with bats.
Interesting.
I don't know that it works on teenagers, but with bats that rely so heavily on that echolocation to sense what's around them, to find their prey as they're flying. If you can't communicate with the world around you and understand what's happening, you're not going to be good at finding food. If you're not good at finding food, you're not going to come back to that same space again. So it feels like there's a lot of promise in that for bats, keeping them away from wind turbines.
Yeah, you're exactly right. The kind of premise that they were developed on is that some moth species actually emit their own echolocation, and it's thought to jam a bat's echolocation so they can't target into that moth.
Wow.
Yeah, and some bat species, some are more generalist, and some actually can basically tell what species of prey that they're going after based on the echolocation patterns bouncing off of that prey item. So yes, tiger moths emit their own echolocation. So it's thought that jams bats' echolocation. So hey, if they're doing it, let's create something similar. We don't really know if that's the correct mechanism. It could just be, basically standing next to a loudspeaker, that kind of thing. Mm-hmm. But either way, it does seem to work.
Once again, when it comes to solving problems that involve nature, the best place to look is also nature. If a tiger moth can use ultrasonic clicks to throw off a bat's targeting abilities, maybe scientists can implement something similar that keeps the bats away from wind turbines. You probably already know that bats use echolocation when they're hunting. They produce super high-pitched clicks, and then they listen to how that sound has changed once it's bounced off of an object and returned to their ears. So if you can introduce some high-pitched sounds of your own, it can make it harder for bats to understand their own signals. And if it's harder to hunt or it's uncomfortable to hang around, those bats are going to go find somewhere easier to forage. That's the goal anyway. But as Sarah explains, there's one big problem.
The issue is that wind turbine blades are getting longer and longer and longer. And right now, these deterrents are typically placed on the nacelle. So they're getting the power from the wind turbine itself. They're plugged in. And so high frequency noises only travel so far in space, right? They just don't travel very far. It's all kind of dependent on temperature and relative humidity. But when you're talking about these crazy kilohertz, if they can go 30, 40 meters, we're doing pretty well. But unfortunately, wind turbine blades are way longer than that.
I'm very glad we're having the opportunity to have this conversation, because this is a really important conversation to have, that everything in the environmental space is trade-off, right? Renewable energy, but that seems to be coming at the cost of increased bat fatality. And so how do we optimize it so that we can decarbonize our energy structure and use renewable energy sources that are not emitting carbon and at the same time preserve biodiversity? Like, where do those intersect in a way that is good for people and good for bats?
Right.
And I think that as we've been at EarthX, there's all of this talk about the polarization that has happened in American thought about the environment and politics in general over the last couple of years. And I think it's very easy for proponents of wind energy to say, this is the solution, right? This is renewable energy, the solution, and we should do only this. And then there's also on the other side of the aisle, people saying, oh, so you love killing bats? That's all wind energy does. And it exists in this spectrum. And it's very easy to simplify it into those two columns and not recognize that there's people like you, experts, PhDs in the field, that are spending every day trying to mitigate these issues so that we can have both wind energy and thriving bat populations.
Absolutely. And there's a big group of us, and it's not only the scientists. I mean, there's a lot of wind energy companies out there, or just energy companies that also do renewables, that are also trying to find solutions, landowners that are trying to find solutions, so biologists. And like I said, even with the deterrents, I mean, we're having to cross so many boundaries because obviously the engineers are creating the deterrents. They're relying on us bat people to be able to guide the engineering of that. But I don't really understand exactly the engineering side of things, so it's a lot of people coming together to try to figure it out.
It kind of takes a team to build all these things. I think that's something we try to share in the podcast often is it doesn't really matter what field you work in. There is probably some way to be involved in this like eco-friendly environmental conservation kind of field. So I have some knowledge about bats, but are they everywhere? Is it looking at like, okay, where can we build these wind turbines? Is there somewhere we can build them that will get similar amounts of energy collected, but maybe there's not a bat population? But you also mentioned that some of these bats are like migratory, so maybe it's an issue anyway. But what does that kind of look like as we move forward in this future of building more wind turbines?
Right. So, yeah, there are bats pretty much everywhere. So we really can't avoid them necessarily. But there is a lot of pre-sighting wildlife studies that are done before the wind farm is built. So that's being done, which is fantastic. But obviously, yes, they are migratory. I mean, we're talking these bats can fly a couple thousand kilometers. Most bat fatalities are happening in the fall. So during their fall migration, less in the spring, although migration's a two-way process, right? They're going and coming back. So that's kind of interesting. But again, just kind of the smart curtailment of understanding, hey, if there's a bat in the area or if bats are really active, knowing when they're active, what weather conditions they're really active at, and shutting down during those periods. And a lot of people are doing that work. So there's also some work that's being developed. I don't know if you've seen what they've done with birds, but they're using thermal cameras to detect large raptors, and that's like a smart curtailment system. And if the raptor's coming in the direction of the wind farm, they can actually shut down certain turbines.
Raptor here, unfortunately, means hawks and eagles, not Jurassic Park.
So there's some work of that being done with bats where it's they're listening for echolocation, and it's called a smart curtailment approach. However, bats are not always echolocating in flight. So if we watch bats with thermal cameras, which we've done at meteorological towers as part of a sighting process, and then also compared that with bat acoustics. So they're feeding when they come out of their day roost and then before they go back in the morning, but they have a lot of activity even when they're not doing that. They're just not always echolocating, or they're not echolocating to the point that we can pick them up with detectors. So obviously having a thermal camera with a little bitty bat is very different than a raptor, but that is one approach.
So it turns out those fancy meteorological tools are good for more than just telling the weather. Just outside of San Antonio, Texas, sits the world's largest bat colony. Bracken Bat Cave is home to 20 million bats, and they show up every night on Doppler radar. The dusk and dawn of every day bring what appears to be a thunderstorm of bats. Can you say batnado? Luckily, we don't have to do the work of figuring out what's a bat and what's a rain cloud.
Absolutely. So yeah, Bracken Cave, 20 million It's about 10 million females. They all have one pup. And if you've seen that on Doppler radar, it's pretty crazy. And if you think about them having to take that out of your weather radar every single day, it's pretty spectacular. Just in the Central Texas region, the same species, there's probably about 100 million. So if you watch just entire Central Texas, it just blows up at that time of night, every night.
It's so cool. And bats are kind of classically a misunderstood species right alongside with snakes and sharks, because people are like, it's going to get in my hair or it's going to give me rabies, which, rabies, they are a rabies vector species. You should always be careful around bats, but bats do so much good for the agriculture of Texas. I mean, they eat their body weight in, let's see if I remember this right. A lot of my bat stuff comes from like 15 years ago, but Mexican free-tail bats can eat their weight in insects nightly.
Probably more. So if you think of just Bracken Cave, so 20 million free-tails live in there. They eat 140 tons of insects every single night. 140 tons. That's also, we were talking earlier about how to conceptualize these large numbers, and it's kind of weird to think about 140 tons of insects, but that is approximate to the weight of 70 F-150s.
Wow.
So, yeah.
Yeah, I was like, how do you relate that to elephants? How many?
Yeah, how many elephants?
So if you drive by a car lot
Yep.
and you see 70 trucks sitting there,
Yep.
that's how many bugs one cave of bats, albeit
One
the
cave.
largest in the world, is eating every night. And a lot of those bugs, insects, are agricultural pests, like
Correct.
the cotton bollworm, right?
Yep, that's it.
Decimates cotton crops and also corn. Is that correct?
Yes.
Yeah. So we're growing corn, which could be another renewable energy source if we're talking about corn-based ethanol, et cetera.
Mm-hmm.
These bats are protecting that and reducing the amount of pesticide use to have a yielded crop by significant amounts. So it is really important that we keep bats around and figure out how that they can exist within this renewable energy structure that we're trying to build.
Absolutely. They just from that one cave, they're estimated to save cotton farmers in an 8-county region, hundreds of thousands of dollars, So all in all, about $53 billion in the U.S. a year for agricultural. Most of the bats that we have here are insectivores, so they eat insects, but they also can pollinate. They do carry pollen around. So,
have you ever been able to witness the emergence at Bracken Bat Cave?
Oh yeah, I was just there last week.
Oh,
I was like, I am sure that she has.
well, you got to ask the questions.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah, I was lucky enough to take my lab down there last week, and I had several new first timers, and it was pretty amazing.
I mean, it's a spectacular experience. Can you describe, like, from your perspective, what it is to be standing outside the mouth of this cave?
Sure.
As they begin to emerge and then sort of like turn into this whole thing? I'll let you tell it. You go.
Okay, so first you park. And as you get out of the car, you can smell them, right? So you're walking up to the cave a little bit, and it's just getting stronger and stronger and stronger.
Yeah, they're a little stinky.
They are a little stinky. The fact that they can live in that ammonia-rich environment is pretty spectacular as well. And then you go and you kind of wait. You're like, okay, when are they going to come out? You never know exactly when they're going to emerge or why they select different times. But then you see one or two start coming out. And they also don't know like what order it's in. So there's a lot of research left to be done on that. I wonder if they're sending scouts out to kind of check the area out. And then come in the raptors. So you have different hawks and falcons and owls. And sometimes if you look around, skunks, snakes, things start coming out because it's such a nutrient-rich environment, basically, right?
Right. I mean, you have to think about they're collecting 140 tons of effectively nutrients from everywhere and then concentrating it into, Bracken Bat Cave is a large cave, don't get me wrong, but it's actually, you don't have any other dimensions of it, do you?
Not exactly. I think it goes back less than a mile, but they have dug down and they haven't found the cave floor. They've gone through like 73 feet or something of guano. Bat poop. Yes. And it's not huge. The mouth of it's not huge.
It's probably 50 feet wide, maybe.
Yeah.
Yeah. And it's, maybe 30 feet tall.
Right.
So it's, you would stumble across it and be like, oh, wow, that's a cave. But it's not like you could fit a stadium inside of it.
Oh, no. And it's just a collapsed like sinkhole, basically, right?
Yeah.
So it kind of forms this really cool bowl right in front of it, which is great to watch them fly out because they come out and they create like a bat tornado. So they just start flying in a circle. And you can just start feeling them fly by. And then if you like cup your ears behind or your hands behind your ears, you can hear their wing flaps. And they do that for a while and then take off.
You would never expect, if it was a bat, it would be hard to hear. But we're talking about millions of bats and it creates this like sound.
Yep.
That is, I mean, you can almost feel it because it is so many animals flying in effectively formation. This, not tight formation, but it's this spiral of smoke, like a trickle of smoke, and then a tornado of smoke looking stuff that goes off and then just goes out into the greater Texas area to go eat 140 million pounds of bugs that night.
Exactly. And those fly about 60 miles away to forage. But yeah, they do form these kind of tight clusters. And what's interesting is they come out differently every night. Sometimes they fly and go straight to the back of the cave, or not back of the cave, but outside, and sometimes they fly more around where there's a little seating area, and you have no idea what they're going to do, but they seem to know what they're doing.
Yeah.
They all kind of stick together and do it. So
They have a plan.
they have a plan.
One of my all-time coolest experiences was getting to walk to the back of Bracken Bat Cave in the off-season when there were no bats, and just experience walking, what it is to walk on top of 70 plus feet of bat poop, which was a really important resource for a while. I mean, there's a mine shaft that sunk at the back of the cave because for a long time, bat poop and bird poop was how we made stuff like gunpowder and fertilizer, because it has all of that nitrate and ammonia, and under the right conditions, you can turn it into an explosive. And so it was a very important resource, a natural resource for the people in the area and for the government in general. Bracken Bat Cave and Texas bats in general will always be one of my most treasured ecological memories.
That's awesome. I'm so glad that you got to go.
It's so cool.
Yeah. Anyone can go. If you're a member of Bat Conservation International, you get to go visit. So I hope anyone can, become the member. I think it's $20 in a year.
Something
and then
like
you
that.
can,
It's really reasonable, and you also get the opportunity to maintain trails around the cave and just help bats, which is a really cool thing to do.
Yeah, I think a lot of people that have visited Bracken have said it's a completely life-changing experience. And you're right about the gunpowder. It was actually protected during the Civil War, and it got its name Bracken because of, I think, a rail station where they used to take the guano. So it was like a Bracken rail station, so they just called it Bracken Cave, and then the name stuck.
That's so cool.
I don't
That's
know how
really
people
cool.
got in there, though. I mean, you can't go in there now without, a double HEPA air mask filter, system and all of that. But I don't know how people got in there to get the guano out a long time ago.
Yeah, they're just like, this is stinky, but we need it, so I guess we'll go.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's so strong. And I haven't had the opportunity to go there. So it sounds like we will need to get our membership and go.
Absolutely.
We should do a little podcast expedition, get any of our listeners who want to come to join along and go. But a question that came up as we were having this conversation, you said they started digging through, they've dug down through 73 feet of guano, so bat poop, and they didn't find the cave floor.
Right.
So my question is, will there be a time when this cave is just full with bat poop and they can't go in there anymore?
Yeah, so, I mean, obviously it has been guano that has been taken out for many years. I think that they'll go in and remove some. I mean, there's also a lot of invertebrate life that is breaking that down. So all over the cave floor are basically domestic beetles, so flesh-eating beetles. So there's just a lot of things that are breaking down those nutrients.
It's a whole ecosystem.
It's pretty crazy. I was down at the mouth of the cave. We were doing a project with a grad student, taking bat hair and looking at heavy metal concentration, like mercury concentrations.
Oh, wow.
And so just at the mouth of the cave, just kind of picking bats off, it's that easy there. You could be down at the mouth for about 5 minutes before I had to turn around and go to the top, and we would give them a little haircut and release them. But I had this awesome picture of a western coach whip, which is a snake. And there was a bat that wasn't doing very well. And the snake came up, and the bat was just kind of hanging there. It wasn't looking very good. And the snake took it and just sat there with it in its mouth. And I was like, oh my gosh, this is a perfect picture. And I had my camera hanging over my shoulder, but I had a bat in my hand in a bag, and I couldn't put it down. So I took a picture with my phone, but I mean, this is a beautiful opportunity to take this picture, and I couldn't even do it because obviously you can't put anything on the floor of the cave.
Right.
And yeah, I mean, we were wearing high boots, and just to look down and see everything kind of squirming, it's
Wild.
wild.
Absolutely wild.
And those bat pups have one chance, they release, they have to learn how to fly before they hit the ground, and
Otherwise, that's it.
that's it.
Yep. So there's a good thing there's a lot of bats, because bats live a very dangerous life.
They do live a very dangerous life.
So you mentioned that, and it kind of brought something back, and I don't know if I'm making this up or not, but can bats take off from the ground?
No, so bats, unlike birds, cannot produce lift. So if you ever see a bat on the ground, it does not mean that it has rabies. Only a very small percentage, less than 1/10% of bats in the wild have rabies. But likely it could get grounded due to a variety of reasons. And it has to find something to climb back up in order to drop and produce that lift to fly off.
Which is why, like, when you put out bat boxes, I've always seen them where it's like there's not a hole at the front. It's basically there's just no bottom to the box because they just drop. They release and like,
Kind of
and
like a
open their
parachute.
wings. Yeah.
Or like those like cliff jumping things with like the little wings.
Yeah, like a
Yeah.
wingsuit.
Yeah.
The wingsuit.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I'd love to come back a little bit more to talking about some of the other work that you've done in the past about the intersection between renewable energy and wildlife species and habitat use. So is there any other work that you're doing now?
Yeah, so one of the big projects we're just finishing up, we finished the field work on it a couple years ago, but we just got it published and we're working on another publication out of that, is testing these bat deterrents. So we really want to find the lowest frequency possible because lower frequencies travel further in space. So we want to find the lowest frequency possible that deters as many bat species as possible. So deterrents have been studied. They've been put on wind turbines and systematically turned on and off to see if they work at decreasing fatalities, and they do.
Wow.
Some species, upwards of 70% of bat fatalities are decreased. So we wanted to learn how individual bats react. So we built a very large flight cage. Well, we thought it was large at the time. When we built it in 2018, it's about 60 meters long, and it was based on the dimensions of a wind turbine blade. And then we fitted 4 thermal cameras outside of the flight cage so we could watch a bat in there at all times. And we wild capture a bat, put it in the flight cage, and have different frequency emissions from a deterrent to see which frequency is making them fly further away from the deterrent. And it seems that a lot of the frequencies are working, so that is fantastic. We probably need to increase the size of the flight cage at this point because, as I mentioned, the turbine blades are just getting longer and longer. And that particular deterrent is one that needs to be put on the nacelle. But here shortly, I'm going to be testing with some of my students and employees 2 new deterrents, and they're hoping that those could actually be mounted on the wind turbine blade. We're going to start with some pond studies. So basically having the deterrent on and off at a pond that has a lot of bat activity, watching bat activity with thermal cameras and acoustic detectors, and then hopefully move those into the flight cage.
That's super cool. That totally triggered something for me of like bats require surface water. Still surface water that has space around it so they can kind of come in, take a drink, and come back out. And
Right.
so ponds are oftentimes a good place to sample or look for bats if you're not, if you don't have a cave aggregating species, you're dealing with, smaller colonies that are more dispersed. Ponds are a really good way to get an idea of what bats are around because that's their only real source of water.
Right. They definitely do drink, but they also get a lot of insects around a pond. So
Also
they
true.
also come in and forage around the area. We're in the stage right now where we're looking for ponds of an adequate size that likely will have water in August and September, which we really don't know.
Never know.
You never know. But we don't want it too large either because we want to be able to track the bats with a thermal camera. But also we don't want one near a roost or anything like that because we don't want to discourage bats from coming into the area for very long periods of time, obviously.
Yeah.
You mentioned a couple of times that these blades for these turbines just keep getting longer and longer. Is that because the longer blades are able to catch more wind? And then if that's the case, when do we say, okay, this is long enough, we are no longer getting any more benefit from making them longer?
I have no idea. That is a great question maybe for an engineer.
Fair.
I have seen this kind of pictograph of what they used to be and then like basically compared to the Statue of Liberty and the Empire State Building and like how they're getting larger and larger. But I don't know where that cutoff is.
I'm definitely not an engineer, but I can try to explain the push for longer turbine blades. Wind turbines work by spinning a magnet that's at the center. When you spin a magnet next to a piece of wire, the magnetic field induces an electric current in that wire. Don't ask me why, because I don't know. Smarter people than me have said to just accept it as fact, so here we are. At the end of the day, the faster you can spin that magnet, the more electricity you can generate. Since you can't make the wind blow faster, you have to come up with ways to make the blades spin faster in the same amount of wind. And one of the best ways to do that is by increasing the length of the blade. Think of the blade like a lever. The longer it is, the more force you can apply to the center of the turbine that's holding that magnet. We call this torque, and a major limiting factor has been the strength of materials available to make those blades. Well, with stronger materials, we can make longer blades that withstand the incredible amount of force being applied. Nowadays, the biggest blades can be more than 400 feet long, meaning that the circle that they rotate through can be well over 10 acres in size. That is a massive area that you're trying to protect bats from. And if you're relying on a sound emitter at the very center of that circle, it needs to be able to send that sound a long way before it fades out.
They're getting bigger, and the offshore ones now are just absolutely massive, right?
All of this conversation we've had today is very terrestrial based. Are there bats that forage over the ocean?
Yeah, so there have been several studies on offshore wind turbines, and yes, they have also the unintended consequence of bat fatalities.
Fascinating. And that's another very interesting question for me is they're out in the ocean. My presumption is that you understand the scale of the fatality issue by walking around the base of it and seeing dead bats at the bottom. How does that...
So they're camera systems and things like that.
Okay.
So they have, they've been documented around wind turbines acoustically and through camera systems. And there's a lot of that work going on. We have just exploded in technological advances in that arena in the past few years, which has been absolutely amazing.
You can't fix something until you can measure it. So It makes a lot more sense that you're using technology rather than being like, oh, we found 7 today.
Well, and that's a big issue with bats is we just don't know a whole lot. We think we know a lot, but when you really compare it to some of the larger animals and some of the more charismatic megafauna, we don't. And that's one, because there just hasn't been as much research, as much money put into it. As you mentioned earlier, people just didn't really see the benefit of bats for a long time, and just publicly, people have kind of a misconception. But also, their nocturnal habits, obviously. They're tiny, they fly, which means any kind of transmitters have to be very small as well, because we don't want to alter their behaviors. So we do put transmitters on bats for like radio telemetry, but those typically lose their battery within 2 to 3 weeks. And of course, you capture a bat and then we just glue surgical glue a transmitter on their back. Then you have to go find them, right? And so some bats are not cave species, and some bats go and roost in different places. You have to go find them, but they also often live in colonies, and they will groom transmitters and things off of each other as well. So they are a very, very tricky taxa to study.
Always a challenge.
Yeah. So is there anything that someone listening could do to help bats in their area?
Sure. So again, Bat Conservation International is just a really great organization, probably the leading bat organization. So that is a fantastic way to support bats. And if there is any kind of rescue organization, we have one in Austin Bat Refuge. They are fantastic. It is 2 people, Lee and Diane. They have a flight cage in their backyard, and they rescue injured and orphaned bats and release them. It's great that it's close to San Marcos, because we have students that go up there and help sometimes as well. So looking up any kind of bat rescue organization and maybe donating to that. But most of the work that us as wildlife biologists, wildlife ecologists do are more at the population level, not the individual level. But it takes everyone joining together.
And at the end of the day, if you're building a relationship between you and bats, and you're having conversations with your friends about bats, and perhaps sharing podcasts about bats with your friends, it all helps, right? Just public
Absolutely.
awareness. I think species that are just very different, have very different lifestyles to humans, tend to lag behind in terms of understanding and awareness about them, just because we're not out at night often and experiencing bats. They have a very different sensory system where, they do have vision. I think it's very important to dispel that myth that bats are blind, but they do rely on echolocation. And, I like to think of bats as charismatic microfauna, because I think they're
Absolutely.
so freaking cute, and they're tiny, and they're like, we need to hire a PR firm for bats, because they are amazing animals. And I think the public should know that.
I agree. Like you said, there's just so many misconceptions, but very few have rabies. People think that they're flying rodents, basically. They're not very closely related to rodents. We don't know some of the evolutionary history, because obviously it's hard to know that without having those direct links still alive, but probably more related to carnivores and even humans than to rodents. They don't have the same life history strategy as rodents at all. We already mentioned the free-tail bats, the Mexican or Brazilian free-tails that live in bracken. They have 1 pup a year. So if you're thinking about how to help a population, that is a very slow moving reproductive cycle, right? Some species can have up to like 4 a year, but that's more rare. But they also are long-lived. So rodents typically don't live as long. The longest bat that we know of is a small myotis, not in the States, but it's like 50-something years old. 50,
Oh my gosh.
Yeah.
I don't think I knew that.
Yeah.
That is for a small mammal
Right.
to live 50 years.
Right.
I actually don't think I can think of another example of a small mammal that lives that long.
Right. And so then they're also very intelligent. It's so weird using the word intelligent when it comes to animals because, I mean, obviously through our lens, we can only relate things to human intelligence. So I really don't like to say that. But they do have, I guess you could say, a complex system of communication. So the echolocation, of course, the bats and bracken, the freetails again, they're known to produce at least 30 different sounds. They have individual recognition. They talk to each other, chat to each other. The mothers know which young are there. So imagine 10 million young, right? So if you think about a piece of paper, there's about 300 on there, like the size of a piece of paper.
To emphasize that,
Yes.
a sheet of paper.
Yes.
Close your eyes, not if you're driving. Hold a sheet of paper in front of you, and then imagine that there are 300 bats hanging on it. That's the density that you find them on the cave walls.
Yes. Yep. And they come back every night and they find their exact young through olfaction and echolocation cues. And yeah, they're just fascinating.
Yeah, they're really, really cool organisms.
Yes.
Yeah. That's really cool. I didn't know that they stayed quite that close together.
Yes.
And they also have global distribution. I'm sorry, I'm going to keep talking about bats because I think they're so cool. They have global distribution because unlike every other mammal, they fly.
Right.
So we can find them in remote locations. Like I think they're the only mammal native to New Zealand, but it's because they can fly.
Right.
They can travel across distances or get blown in storms and like stay aloft until they find land to land on. And so they're just a really ecologically interesting taxa because they just have such a different life strategy to pretty much every other mammal in existence.
Yeah. And if you think about, I mean, when we were saying, being able to migrate a couple thousand of kilometers, this is such a tiny animal flying. Imagine like wind in that tiny little, animal flying through. And just the patagium, as you mentioned, I mean, there's no kind of letting that wind up, right? And the freetails, I mean, they've been documented to forage at over 10,000 feet in altitude, and they're the fastest animal as well. In free flight, they can fly 100 miles per hour.
Man.
Wow, that's crazy.
So like next time you're on a flight and your captain is like, ding, we've now reached 10,000 feet of altitude. You can use your phones and tablets now. That's where Mexican free-tail bats are traveling at and like getting up there and bats are heavy metal. They are like so freaking cool.
Yes. And, it's so unfortunate that people don't know more about them. And, because they're cool on their own account, but they're also so helpful for people as well.
Yeah. Well, hopefully people know a little bit more after listening to this episode. Like Chance said, I think we could keep talking about this for a while longer.
I know I can.
I know you could. But thank you so much for joining us on the show today. It was really great to meet you and to have you on. And I know I definitely learned some new things about bats.
Thanks for having me. This has been really fun.
I hope you loved that episode as much as I love bats.
Yeah, it was a super fun episode for us to record. We're really enjoying this new voiceover era that we're in right now. So we hope you're loving that as well.
You're such a Swiftie. So Sarah Catherine, what did you learn this week?
So one of the craziest things I learned this week came at the end of the episode, actually. Well, there were a lot of crazy things that I learned, but one of them was that Mexican free-tail bats can fly up to 10,000 feet in the air, which is the same altitude as just like Chance said in the episode, the pilot comes on and is like, hey, you can get your phone and laptop out. To think that I could look out the window and be like, oh, it's a bat. I mean, that would never happen, but the possibility's there.
It would be crazy. I'm definitely going to be thinking about it when we're flying to Sun Valley this week.
Yeah, every time I'm in a plane. What did you learn?
I had no idea that there are moths that could echolocate. And I don't know if echolocate is the right word because there's no real way to know if they're using that data to understand where things are in space, but they sure as heck are using it to not get eaten by bats. I was reading the original study from 2009 where they were talking about, like, we don't really know what the moths are doing this for. Is it to tell bats that they're poisonous? Is it to tell bats, to jam their radar or what it is? And it was like, nope, they're definitely 100% doing it because it makes the bats lose sight of where they are, basically.
Yeah, the bats are like, what the heck is going on?
These are some real loud moths when it comes to moths.
That's crazy. I want to meet these moths.
Yeah, a tiger moth. I'm going to have to look up what they look like.
I know.
All I did was read about them and like their scientific name and stuff. So I'm going to have to Google like a picture.
For sure.
Something you might notice that's a little different this week is that we no longer can do question and answers on Spotify. They've changed it to comments. So you guys can now leave comments directly under this episode on our Spotify page. So if you guys listen on Spotify, feel free to comment on our stuff. I want to know what you thought about the episode. If you don't use Spotify, that's fine. Find us on Instagram. Shoot me an email. I want to talk to you. You guys are like my favorite people.
Yeah, and on Spotify, we can even comment back to you. So you can be like, you're awesome, and we can say, you're awesome too. So it's a great little community builder.
We can just all be friends. Let's be friends. I want to be your friend.
As always, if you want to help us grow this podcast, if you love us as much as we love you, you can leave us a review like we mentioned. You can also share the show with your friends. If you find an episode that you love, that you think they'll love, go ahead and share it with them. And if you're inclined to donate to our nonprofit, then you can find that on our website.
So I love talking about bats, but what are we talking about next week?
Next week, we are talking with George Cummings, who is a diver, UN SDG 14 Ocean Ambassador, a co-founder of South by Southwest Interactive, and a biochemist.
Just generally a wild thing that's trying to protect the oceans.
Yeah, he is a man of many trades. And our journey in that podcast takes us kind of all over the ocean world and even into what he thinks is one of the biggest solutions of how we can help the planet.
Tune in next week to find out. Thanks so much for listening, and we'll see you next Tuesday.